Pema Chodron, a Tibetan Buddhist nun, writer, and teacher, advised her students that if we learn to open our hearts, anyone, including the people who drive us crazy, can be our teacher. I remember my student days at Queens College when my mentor professor and I would share a cab back to Manhattan following his late afternoon lecture. Before joining the faculty, he was a speechwriter for Adlai Stevenson, and his dad was a speechwriter for Harry Truman. So when he lectured on 20th century American and British political rhetoric, it was a packed house. In our cab ride back to the city, we would often giggle about a particular student in the class, a woman by the name of Mrs. Sinclair, who was one of those annoying older adults who really stuck out in a lecture hall filled with young, energetic, and vibrant undergraduates. Oh, we passed judgment on her appearance and her demeanor, wildly guessing why this old woman would dare to return to college. We were not very flattering. Call it catty. One evening following his lecture, as I was hanging around waiting for us to take the cab back to the city, Mrs. Sinclair comes forward and approaches the professor. She said to him, "You don't like me very much, do you?" That was the first time I saw my mentor flustered, ever. Of course, he lied to her face, and he said he had no ill feelings towards her whatsoever. Why did she even suspect otherwise? And she said, "You think I'm a Republican, don't you?" Well, he kind of smiled and said sheepishly, "You're not?" "No," she said, "I'm not. My father-in-law was Upton Sinclair." Well, that kind of threw us. Upton Sinclair is every teacher's model of muckraking, and his book, The Jungle, was, of course, the classic rabble-rousing sensation, exposing the meatpacking industry. He was sort of the Ed Snowden of his day. So from that night on until the end of the semester, Mrs. Sinclair joined us in the cab going back to the city. She regaled us with terrific stories, funny stories, and offered amazing insights on a variety of topics, all of them liberal-leaning. If we learn to open our hearts, anyone, including the people who drive us crazy, can be our teacher. I'm bothered a great deal by how easily we make judgments. Unfounded judgments, mostly because we judge before we know any better. And I'm certainly not exempt from this flaw that seems to be part of human nature. Even the term passing judgment sends chills up my spine because it feels so out of character for me. I definitely do not ever feel myself so exalted or exemplary in my living that I have this license to judge others. And yet, I seem to fall into the same patterns that typifies most of humanity, making snap judgments instead of building bridges. The expediency of making judgments has an insidious quality about it, a false sense of power gained by just dismissing other people out of hand without much effort to engage in the art of understanding another human being. And then there are judgments made about kinds of people who belong to certain tribes, be they religious, cultural, class, ethnic. Judgments create huge divisions among people. Judgments are made about Muslims with no pursuit of any reasonable understanding of who they are. Judgments are made effortlessly about immigrants with no clear understanding about who they actually are. Judgments are made callously by members of Congress about the poor, totally ignorant of their lives, yet holding them accountable for our budget deficit. At the heart of passing judgment lies our own foible of desiring people or cultures to be the way we want them to be. Is this a recipe for disaster or what? You start off with a certain bias or dissatisfaction over how a person or culture or class happens to be, and then you mix in your desire for them to be otherwise. And what remains a constant then is the negativity and dissatisfaction that becomes more and more intense. An easy example of wanting to change people might be found right in our own families. You know, we're getting closer to the holidays where many of us will be sitting around the table with relatives whom we've judged long ago with varying degrees of disdain. So here's an exercise that might help you prepare for your next family gathering. Can you let them be the way they are without desiring them to be otherwise? Can you let them be the way they are without desiring them to be otherwise? I'm reminded of Walt Whitman's classic line, "I contain multitudes." Well, maybe we need to see that in people. It's not just one narrow bias. They contain multitudes. And I have to remind myself that even my Aunt Trudy may contain multitudes herself. The issue of passing judgment actually draws a lot of attention in our Western culture. In our scriptures, we see that in scriptures it turns judgment around and aims it back at those who judge. Judge not, that ye be not judged. In other words, if you think you're so pure to cast judgment on others, why, you'll get a bitter taste of your own medicine by the one who is in the only position to judge. Take care of your own problems. In judging others, you can't help but appear to be a hypocrite. Why beholdest thou the splinter in your brother's eye, but consider not the beam that is in thine own eye? Actually, that's one of my favorites. It makes me feel very contrite. I think, though, the sternest admonition against judging others is found in the Gospel of Mark. For with what judgments ye judge, ye shall be judged. And with what measures you mete it, it shall be measured to you again. So if you start dishing out judgments, you better run for cover, because it's coming back right at you in the same proportion. The idea of passing judgment is deplored as shamefully self-righteous, as demonstrated in the great story of the woman who committed adultery and was about to be stoned to death by these self-righteous prigs. And Jesus springs to the aid of the woman and asks those who have judged her so harshly, "He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her." Wow. That's powerful stuff. Anyone who claims publicly that he or she is flawless, without sin, would become a laughingstock. So as flawed creatures, who are we to judge, let alone throw stones? Jesus does not pretend the adulteress is innocent. He merely protects her from judgment. When the equivalent of a lynch mob dispersed in that scene, he turns to the woman and he says, "Go, but sin no more." She made some mistakes, but he's not her defense attorney, just making sure that she isn't judged disproportionately hard. Jesus introduces the concept that we ought to examine ourselves more critically, as though we were judging ourselves from a divine perspective. Now that's hard. In doing so, we can't rationalize our behavior. We need to imagine what God thinks of our behavior and attitude. And so there's no running away or hiding. And this is actually the fundamental principle guiding the highest Jewish holy day of the year, Yom Kippur, observed just yesterday. You see, there is a book, a big book in which God inscribes all our names. On Yom Kippur, God's judgment of us is entered in the book, and it's sealed. That's it. This is the last chance you've got to change God's judgment of you. So you repent, atone, make amends. And when you think about it, there's really no better self-analytical tool than the idea that God is judging you. Let's face it, you have to be honest. There's no choice. You'd rather not have any black marks next to your name in the book. Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement, wields a powerful image. You don't need to be Jewish in order to understand the implications of being judged yourself, you being judged now, by a mighty and discerning, all-knowing spirit who then jots down notes about you in the margins of the book. Now, is there really a God who sits in judgment of you on an annual basis or however frequent? Probably not. But the image, the story, the myth expresses the truth about our humanness. We are prone to making judgments, always have and probably always will. But an awareness of this propensity. God, I hate cell phones. I go, no, I don't make the John. But an awareness of this propensity can at least set us on the path of repairing our relationships with others. This exercise of deep reflection about our behavior merits a wider following than just the Jewish population. The efforts to make amends deserves to be far more widespread. The idea is to reconcile with those whom you have hurt. It's an opportunity to get things squared away. There are many transgressions we commit against others: swindling, lying, cheating, stealing, intimidating. But there's also the issue of our own proclivity to judge others, an action that tears apart the threads of human connection. We must consider the damage that we create when we either ruthlessly or non-thinkingly pass judgment on another human being. And so Yom Kippur provides a great opportunity built into the Jewish tradition that allows for the reparation of relationships with family members, friends, colleagues, and those whom we really don't know very well but judge anyway. Making judgments exacts a huge toll in human relations. We also need to be clear that we make judgments all the time because we have to. For example, we need to judge the actions of our children to help shape their character and to keep them safe. No, sweetie, that's just too much makeup for a junior high dance. You can't go. This kind of judgment, that's not what I'm talking about. We need to understand the distinction between judgment and being judgmental. Now, this is not a game of semantics. Being judgmental means being overly critical in an unhelpful way. Making judgments in ways that have negative consequences are exactly what we need to learn to avoid. It's this harmful form of judgment that must be understood by us totally inside our hearts, internally, so that we can reconcile with those to whom we have caused harm. I believe it is really important to identify, perhaps more precisely, what exactly this failing is that makes God so upset about our making judgments and fills the Bible with all these threats about being judged ourselves. What is basically the harm if we judge our respective Aunt Trudys or minorities or gays or women or Muslims or the poor? What's the harm? It all comes down to a failure in empathy. In our judgment, we neglect to consider where the other is coming from, their perspective, their history, their experience. People who cannot empathize lack the ability to feel another's pain or point of view. And I cannot emphasize nearly enough the connection between casting judgments and the lack of empathy. In our lack of empathy, we fail to recognize a common humanity. We fail to understand that we are all burdened by imperfections and thus need to regard one another with more love. Or as Pema Chodron said, we must learn to open our hearts. What a concept. Opening our hearts. Think about what that possibly means. It speaks not only to a kind of gentleness, but I think it really offers a path to wisdom. Opening our hearts cannot be done until we are wise enough to understand the breadth of all that includes. By opening your hearts, you let in justice, generosity, compassion, gratitude, humility, love. I believe that it is in moving closer to wisdom that we ask, how do I judge myself? In this unpredictable and short life, how best do I use the time I am allotted? This is a deeply personal question, and by no means do I purport to offer the definitive answer. Besides, we need to judge ourselves in our own way. We must figure out for ourselves how best to use the time left to us on this precious earth. And then it will become quite clear how our judgment of others detracts from all that could be possible. It's not an easy task, but the pursuit of wisdom was never intended to be easy. If we learn to open our hearts, anyone, including those who drive us crazy, can be our teacher. So be it.